All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the 2025 Forest and Climate Learning Exchange Series, where this year we're having six panel-style webinars covering different topics of forest carbon offsets and natural climate solutions. Today's topic is additionality. But before we get into that, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors and co-hosts. So the Learning Exchange Series has been ongoing since around 2017. We bring together kind of thought leaders to have a dialogue about important topics related to forest, carbon, and climate. The series is sponsored by the Society of American Foresters, which is a national scientific and education organization representing forestry and related natural resource professionals across the United States. SAF was founded in 1900 and promotes science-based sustainable management and stewardship of our nation's public and private forests. This year as well, we are being co-hosted by Penn State University and the FOSSI program, which is the Forest Owner Carbon and Climate Education Program. Our next webinar is in 2 weeks, which will be talking about research priorities to reduce forest carbon leakage. I myself, Chad Papa, will be moderating a panel where I'm joined by Ethan Belair, Barbara Haya, and Brent Songen, and we'll have a great discussion kind of around what is leakage, how do we quantify that, and what are some research priorities going forward to inform leakage around future forest carbon offsets. If you'd like to register for that webinar, please use the QR code here, as well as we'll put a link in the chat as well for the registration of that webinar. This webinar is eligible for future continuing education credits through both SAF, the Society of American Foresters, as well as ISA, the International Society of Arboriculture. If you registered with the same email to this webinar that you have through your SAF profile, the credits will automatically be applied to your account. And if you're looking for ISA CEUs, please email forestc@msu.edu, and we can help you get approved for those credits. So just some quick housekeeping as well. So I encourage everybody to join the Forest Carbon and Climate Program mailing listserv. You can see on the right there, we have a QR code. And then as well, we have the Q&A function enabled in the webinar space, as well as the chat function. So if you have questions throughout the webinar, please use both of those, and we will do our best to have the panelists address those questions throughout the webinar. And so with that, I'm very excited to announce our panel today for addressing uncertainties in the additionality of forest carbon offsets. So I am joined by Adam Daigneault from University of Maine, Lilli Kaarakka from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, Greg Latta from University of Idaho, and Marga Fernandez from Pennsylvania State University. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to hand over the webinar to our today's moderator, Adam.
Great, thank you, Chad. Welcome, everyone. It's an honor to be moderating today's panel. It's also good to see that what's up next in the panel is all about leakage. I believe Greg and I were part of a discussion through one of these almost the same exact time last year. So I don't know if we moved on or moved back to, we'll talk about additionality today, but we're joined from people much wiser than myself, Marga and Lilli. Thank you for joining us with that. So I'm Adam Daigneault. I'm Associate Professor Forest Policy and Economics at the University of Maine, in addition to being Director of the School of Forest Resources here. Background-wise, it's been close to 20 years that I've been working on issues related to forest carbon and offsets. And some of those same sort of topics seem to be coming around time and time again, and so additionality is definitely one of them. The intent here is that I'm going to sort of introduce some sort of key terminology, really more at the definition stage, as opposed to introducing some of the concerns and things like that, or how to deal with those concerns. We're going to leave those types of questions to issues to the panel. And so with that, I'm going to share a few things. All right, so in the grand scheme of things, when you talk about sort of attributes and eligibility for carbon offset projects, there's typically a number of attributes that come in mind. A lot of things that we hear about are sort of Key attributes are sometimes raised as concerns in terms of whether something is truly a sort of credible offset, have to do with aspects of additionality, permanence, and leakage. So, and today we're going to talk really all about additionality, so I want to focus on that. And what do we mean about this? It's really sort of at its highest level. You have a forest carbon project, maybe something that's doing improved forest management or afforestation or something like that. And what it's doing, it's sequestering. The idea is that by doing that project and changing your behavior on that forested landscape, you're storing more carbon than what we might consider a business as usual or BAU or a baseline scenario, or sometimes people might refer to that as sort of a counterfactual case. But the idea is that you have additional carbon on the landscape created by some sort of activity that you've chosen, or in some cases not chosen not to do, that it's a deviation from the baseline or status quo. And to be eligible, really, the project itself must demonstrate that this carbon sequestration would not have otherwise happened without the offset project development. That is, the offset project itself was providing an additional incentive to the landowner, land manager to change their behavior from what they would have done otherwise, right? And so it's the key is that behavior change that's driven purely by that carbon offset incentive is what is additional. So we can think about that sort of in some graphical cases. So here you might think about the case where you have a certain project where you already have a part of your landscape is forested and your carbon is growing over time. And then what might happen is that maybe let's say you are managing some sort of plantation style forestry or even age forest where you're intending largely to do some sort of cut, say after 40 years, and then allow it to grow for another 20 to 40 years, and then do another maybe smaller intensity harvest and do that perpetually. And that's sort of what the baseline plan would be, right? And so what that's doing is saying that on average, you're going to basically be somewhere down along the sort of averaging across that yellow line. That's your baseline or business as usual case. That's what you would have been done without any sort of management activity that is incentivized by the carbon offset. So say now there's a case where you're investing in a carbon offset project that basically pays for what we might call improved forest management, IFM, and that's paying for a management activity that delays the harvest. And so what that does is you're extending your rotation such that you're cutting less frequently and maybe at a lower level of intensity. So as a result, the amount on the landscape that if you went out and measured carbon at any specific time, it's following what that green line is. And so the key is that if the business as usual would be these sort of cuts that get you down around the yellow line, and you're following now a behavior thanks to the payments you got from carbon offsets around the green line, all the shaded green area is what is considered to be additional. And that additional amount of carbon, that's the amount that you're getting paid for under that offset. We can also look at this in a sort of specific context. So in the one I gave before is saying that the baseline is kind of jumping around, right? And this is a way that you can measure on a specific project. But often the way that these projects are credited are they assume some sort of common practice or average baseline in a given area. So often this is basically done by a specific forest ecosystem or some sort of geographical area. And the idea, again, is the baseline would be that you would be sort of credited above might be across that average, such that if you enroll in a project that gets you on the blue line, the amount that you're going to be credited now would be the difference between that sort of dotted line or the gray line and the blue line, right? And so you can think about different ways, again, that now you're deviating from exactly what maybe you said you would have done, and instead it would be basically based on some sort of average. So that's another way that a lot of these crediting projects do it. Instead of trying to base the belief purely on what you said you would have done, instead you go and look across the landscape and say, on average, how are people managing these types of forests? And as a result, we should provide credits above and beyond that, because we're assuming that that is what's truly additional based on sort of averages across whatever given forest ecosystem that may be. And lastly, I do want to touch upon this sort of definition that has come up in time. So you really can't talk about additionality without talking about what the baseline may be. And in sort of in more recent times, we've typically deviated from thinking purely as having additionality be measured above what we would consider a static baseline. So that's the example of the flat line I have here in the CARB crediting, right? But the idea that maybe over time, you're actually seeing the areas in forests that are in a given area that are not enrolled in a carbon project that are also increasing their carbon stocks, right? And so that can be for a number of different reasons, not directly associated with the offset project. But the idea there then is that if you're up at the green line, and you're being credited for a certain amount, that really maybe what you want to do is the carbon benefit is truly, again, not what the expectation was in the first year of the project compared to what the baseline looked like, but this dynamic baseline where there's actually changes in sort of what the overall forest ecosystem may be looking like. And therefore, what's truly additional in this context would be less than if you measured across this sort of flat static baseline. So that's sort of one other way to think about this when we hear the term sort of static versus dynamic when we're talking about baselines. So if that's enough, I think, for definitions, and we can hopefully set the scene. And I'm going to pass it on to others to speak their mind. I'm not certain who wants to go next. I don't know if that provokes someone to say, oh, I definitely think I fit in and best next. So I'll wait if Lilli, Marga, or Greg want to raise their hand. If not, I'll do an assignment. Oh, it looks like Lilli's taking charge. So Lilli, you're next.
Yes. Yeah, I just thought that this would be a good fit for, can you guys see my screen? We have to ask that on Zoom. Great.
Yep.
Yeah, so kind of continuing on that note and thinking of like the series that we have at SAF for this webinar too, is that I think a lot of discussion has been sort of market based. So I think it's great that we have folks here, including myself. We're going to talk a bit more about like the main, like on the ground forest management that was touched on the previous webinar as well, but more kind of bringing that into focus. So I just had this front slide. I won't go with my skill sets outside of just my name. But yeah, so one of the things I do want to highlight in this discussion is that we tend to talk about two things in this forest carbon market offset realm. So we have this sort of market that's driven by incentives of consumers and companies wanting to offset their emissions. And then we have this other world that tends to burn, at least where I'm from in California and parts of the West, and face a lot of disturbances. And these somehow have not kind of found each other until very recently. So this is something that we try to figure out in some of the research that I do and my students do, is that you're looking at a picture of the start of the Dixie Fire taken by a PG&E camera. I won't go into the politics of that, but just highlighting that this was an example that for the first time there was discussion about that the purchases of the offsets were unaware that this could happen to their projects, right? And then kind of thinking
Lilli,
how
sorry, are you supposed to be advancing the slides? We still see the one with your name on it.
you do,
Yeah.
I am advancing them. I am looking at a picture of,
I was like, I'm looking at what looks to be pictures of your students.
well, I mean, they're great students. I wonder if Chad could change the slide because mine will change, but Chad's doesn't. If you could, can you, I'll just do it manually. How about now? Nothing?
Coming. I saw briefly a picture with a big
Yeah, I see black screen.
Oh, well, this is the happy joy of Zooming. Well, my
If you
computer
speak
also
out,
just froze.
yeah, if you
Yeah,
speak
I
out,
am
it'll
in
go
I,
better.
I am
Okay.
in DC, so I don't know if the power was cut from the
Oh my
building.
God. So,
But
Lilli, if you don't go into presentation mode, we were able to see most when you flipping through it. So
yeah, it's now I'm just in a frozen computer mode. So we have that.
Well, we
Okay,
can still
so
hear you. So
well, that's always good, and these things happen. So yeah, we could probably I could just talk about things, and then Margaret can go after me and see if she can share it. But because my screen is very frozen. But yeah, just kind of going back to the fact that we're trying to figure out ways that what is improved forest management on the ground, the term that we hear a lot in the market. How do we on the research side in California as well as across the West kind of define resilience and resistance in these forests, as well as how those relate to the carbon market context. And then finally, I had a great slide, but I do want to just verbally mention it too, that I'm actually currently in DC because I work in the Society of American Forests Policy Committee, and we just finished our carbon offset statement. And these are policy statements that are, geared towards the public across our membership, of course, within SAF, but also people in policymaking roles, stakeholders in forestry. And these are kind of a low-hanging fruit for spreading out to your constituents or for you to read as well in terms of like what the thinking within SAF is about some of these emerging activities as well as events in the offset market, but also how do we see as professional foresters, how do we see the role of markets in the future and the current and in the future? Because these things, as you probably know, are moving very fast right now. So yeah, and I'm happy to answer all questions and hopefully we'll see some slides from you later, but if not, that's okay too.
Okay, great. That's a great adaptation, Lilli. So thank you for that. Hopefully we can find a way to unshare her screen as well. I'm going to pass it over to you, Marga, and see if you, hopefully maybe you can override her if you attempt to share.
I can, well, it says that I cannot share because someone else is sharing. I don't know if you can.
Okay, all right, let's try now because it looks like someone at least got quit out. So try again.
I think I can. Let me see. This is 3. Do you see my slide?
Yes, excellent.
Awesome.
All right,
okay.
back on track.
Yes. Okay. So, just stepping from everything that Lilli was mentioning, which is super interesting. I come from a more biological ecosystem science perspective of this topic. I'm an ecologist, Marga Fernandez, for all of you that are attending today that don't know me. I'm a postdoc researcher in the Ecosystem Science and Management Department at Penn State. And there are a few things that I have been working lately that I see that could be challenges, but I also see them as a lot of opportunities in terms of providing evidence on this biological uncertainty coming from forest systems. And one of the first things that I was seeing in preforest management projects was that a lot of people was putting forward this idea of no management or delayed harvest as the holy grail for achieving yield, maximum yield of carbon and climate benefits. And me and my colleagues were interested on understanding from a more long-term ecological perspective, what people was experimenting in the field and from experimental efforts, if that was the truth. So we went over and reviewed many articles from the Eastern US forest, and we found that this is not the case. It really depends, and we actually need more quantitative evidence to provide more quantification of how much carbon there is at the sites, how the carbon is moving among different compartments, and how much of that additionality is actually happening in our forests. And as an ecologist, I see this evaluating net primary productivity. So this depends on a lot of things. One of them is past management. So especially in the Eastern US, I'm in Pennsylvania. Depending on what management you have done in your land, your forest conditions are going to be very different. And that's what we talk about when we talk about baselines. And we're going to discuss this a little more. But I just want to add that there are other layers of complexity that has to do with the different forest types that we have across the landscape. And there's a spatial and the time component to that also, especially in our rotation. When you think about 80 or 100 years, a management plan can involve many different interventions, and that will really change how the carbon is moving across at the stem level and then at the landscape level. And in preforest management, also it's been recently defined. Lilli has done a lot of work with our colleagues on that. And something I found really interesting as an ecologist is this new approach of managing for structural complexity. And we know because of research that structural complexity is positively related to carbon storage and sequestration. And some of the opportunities that I see from research, and I'm currently working, at least in Pennsylvania, in private forest lands, we need to understand better what are the conditions at different sites. And there are opportunities to evaluate the outcomes in terms of carbon sequestration, carbon stocking, and structural complexity, especially aligned with programs that help people to achieve management goals. Even when we know that a lot of people is not currently doing management because of financial barriers and other type of social aspects that are not allowing them to do so. And my second point to bring to the discussion today has to do with moving a little, and I think that a big opportunity for offset projects is to move from this carbon centralized message, this is the way to sequester more carbon, to more like bring people evidence about other co-benefits. So if we try to show people that if they have this forest stand that is probably degraded or that has lower regeneration because of past managements, we can actually bring them that quantitative evidence that active management can help them achieve higher tree species regeneration, more diversity on age sizes, and different vertical and structural, horizontal diversity that actually leads to more carbon stocks. And it's also influenced forest health and also wildlife species that they care about. I just put examples here, birds, because people love birds. But I think that also is important to understand that low carbon stocks not always relates to bad forest stand conditions, and it's actually good to boost carbon sequestration. And for a lot of projects, a balance between both can be a good thing. So those are some of the things that I'm trying to quantify right now with a grant that we just got. And that is important to really engage people. If we don't engage private or people that own private forest land, probably the success of escalating carbon offset projects is not going to be a success. So that's my 2 cents. And I'm going to stop sharing so our people can share.
All right, so then I imagine we're moving on to me, and I'll see if I can not screw up stuff, which means I will screw it up.
Oh
okay,
man, are you blaming me for screwing up? Oh,
no, I'm not
goodness.
blaming you for screwing up. I'm just preparing them for me to screw up.
I think we're just introducing you to the club, Lilli.
My name is Greg Latta. I'm a director of the Policy Analysis Group at the University of Idaho. So I'll maybe try and balance things out and not go the academic route. I do work in academia. I've worked like with Adam for 20 years plus, like he says, writing papers and working on some of the accounting that we used to do when we were involved in international agreements. And more recently, I also work in the marketplace. So I've developed multiple carbon methodologies, including the ACR, Improved Forest Management Methodology. That's the one back in 2014. So it was probably a little before that we were putting that together. And then also helped on the VM 0045, or the dynamic baseline for the Family Forest Carbon Program. So involved with that as well with David Schock. And probably 10 to 12 at least carbon projects across both ARB and ACR methodologies. Let me see if I can click forward. So what we're really talking about when we talk about baselines is what people are doing and what they're getting paid for, and what's irritating people in this. So when I looked out there in September, there were 158 projects on 6.2 million acres for ARB, Improved Forest Management. It's about 2 million credits, sorry. There were 83 on 2.5 on ACR. Since then, I just looked the other day, another 19 projects have come in on ACR, Improved Forest Management, representing about 700,000 additional acres. What have they been doing? This ACR graph I have highlights 2 things. So when Adam was showing the graph of how people are paid, you're paid either for what I'm calling here avoided emissions, or an ACR speak, emissions reduction. And that's the gray bar. So that's been the vast majority of all the credits that have been awarded to date. I think it's 85% have been avoided emissions credits or emissions reductions credits. So you're basically being paid. It's a passive mitigation thing. You're paid against a counterfactual baseline or a common practice for something you may not have done. So here I have that's very dependent on additionality. The other thing, like next week or whenever you're going to talk about leakage and additionality go hand in hand. If these credits were not additional, then there would be no leakage. If they are additional, there could be high leakage on those. It's kind of a, chicken and egg thing on that. So avoided emissions have been the bulk of the credits out there. And then this removals, that's the growth. So that kind of uptick, and that's a direct mitigation activity. So you're actually paying when you observe an increase in the stocks that you've measured on the site. Right now, in ACR, they do separate these credits, and the price difference is pretty high between the two. And it's very hard to sell those avoided emissions credits or emissions reductions credits because people just don't want to buy them. You're going to end up in the news if you buy these credits, right? They're bogus. There's a pervasive problem with additionality. They're a scam, or they're junk credits that you get. So we can talk all about that when we talk about baselines, because baselines are what drives the junkness of them. And we can also talk about what we can do to make things better. One thing I would suggest right now is that it does not involve USDA. So if you look at the political spectrum over the last 12 years or so, and the days of executive orders, it is not the place for any kind of consistency in a long-term investment strategy like forestry to have that sort of volatile political environment involved. So it's got to be something that SAF, private forestry, or individual markets are involved with, not USDA, not the federal government. So that's my pitch on that one. And with that, I will kick it back to Adam.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, all three. All right, so I think I want to pick up. We had a few sort of predetermined questions that we've talked about, and we set the stage quite well. And a lot of this, right, we're talked about, I talked a little bit about not just what the definition of additionality is, but then baselines. And then every one of us sort of talked about a little bit more about how to measurement. Lilli, you referred to forest management aspects. We talked about the biological implications of this. So I just want to follow up and dig a little bit deeper. And I've already assessed that. I've tried to answer a few of the questions in the Q&A, but a lot of questions already are coming on. What is the right way to measure a baseline? And yeah, so I'm just going to leave it at that. In our own opinion, like sort of what's the right way to measure a baseline? And maybe we can think about it initially from an academic perspective, right? And then come back to more real world case as well. So, Margarita.
Okay, yeah. So it really depends on the type of project, but in my case that I'm working with forest management scenarios, I'm mostly focusing on forest inventory data, which is in private forest land. When you're trying to assess what is past management, it's a little difficult. Right now, we're solely relying on forest inventory and analysis data, which I think is a huge tool because the US has an extensive network plots, and in many countries where these junk offset credits that Greg was showing, they don't have that. So I think there are many avenues to maybe make that better. But I think that, yeah, using good sampling methods for forest inventories, you can really reduce uncertainty that way. And uncertainty can come from your sampling methods for the data that you have available, the techniques you're using. Right now, we're seeing a lot of advances on incorporating remote sensing, LiDAR data. AI tools are coming forward. So I think that we will always need on-the-ground data. That's the way to go. I think that we cannot get rid of that, even though people that love other type of satellite stuff, those are super helpful, but I think that you should have both. But right now what I'm working with is on the ground, and I don't know if someone else can add to that.
Yeah, and I just want to make one point. Exactly that, is that there's sort of a number of tools in the toolkit we can use, including remote sensing. But again, my understanding as a non-remote sensor is that to calibrate those models, you still need ground-based inventories, right? And a good inventory can be excellent for helping to calibrate that, which can make things more efficient, potentially over the long run, but it's not like you can just start shooting lasers and automatically get the answer, right?
Yeah.
You need to be able to rely on ground data to do that. Lilli, you
Yeah, and
unmuted, so
adding,
I'm going to pass to you.
yeah, so I just wanted to add to that baseline discussion also because I was answering a question about it in the Q&A too, is that again, alluding to FIA data, which is the foundation for these baselines and all these projects. And I mean, that's a valuable tool. But I mean, Craig knows this too, having worked a lot with that as well as Adam, but there are areas that have very high densities of wood, if we just think about wood as carbon, but have very spotty inventory plots. And just to kind of give the background to is forest inventory analysis data is produced by the federal government. So essentially, this is a resource that's currently not under, a chopping block based on a current knowledge, but these are still resources that are funded by efforts of the federal government. And there's a lot of private entities and us in academia, as well as private companies and market folks who use this data. But again, in very sort of high carbon density areas, thinking of where I'm from, California and parts of Oregon, Washington, if we look at maps where offset projects are located, we tend to see a lot of them there. And the other thing I do want to mention with the baseline question, I'm hoping I'm not taking this to the wrong direction too, is that even outside of federal forest and federal land, a lot of the Western forests are overstocked. We have decades of fire suppression. And if we if that's our baseline that we've excluded an historic disturbance that has occurred within 5 to 45 years in almost all the forest biomes, essentially forest ecosystems in the like west of Nebraska, then there's going to be an ecological footprint of that. So we have legacies of standing dead wood as this lying dead wood. So if we remove that, but we're still missing that link in the baseline discussion. But that's again me as an ecologist. But I feel like this is also shared in the community of foresters, regardless if they're in the private sector or not. So the sentiment that we can't just assume that the baseline's here when we've actually managed it all the way up there by not managing, if that makes sense. I'm so happy I had this thing here so I can use it.
That's excellent. And then in most of the sort of generic examples, including the one I've used, it's the dynamic baseline is going up. More and more is happening, right? But almost it sounds like in some ways your point you raised is that baseline actually could be going down, and there could be more and more even achieved with not just increasing stocks over what it is today, but even being able to maintain that relative to other cases because it's already overstocked and at risk.
Yeah, and when we have an event like Dixie Fire, the picture I was trying to show and such, then it all goes up in the air as carbon dioxide. So we have this legacy of not managing when we've had managed it in the past, and we're not doing it effectively now.
Okay, Greg, anything else to add on that?
No, I mean, I see a room for both a dynamic baseline, and when I say dynamic, I'm thinking of the Vera approach, not the dynamic adjustment of ACR. Right, when I think there's a place for that and a counterfactual. I mean, I can say from working on projects where you're evaluating land acquisitions and a potential carbon project, a dynamic baseline doesn't lend itself well to that because there's no guarantee of money that you're going to get out of the project. Whereas, the counterfactual baseline does lend itself well. It's something we've done in forestry for, decades, since we've had kind of the computing power to do it. So I think there's a place for both. I just think more and more it's going to be the quality of the project that you put together. So it'll be working with buyers of a project to make sure that there is some sort of additionality, where we haven't seen that necessarily in the past. And I think that'll be it. There's a room for a dynamic baseline. There's a room for a dynamic baseline adjustment, or whatever you want to call it, what ACR is doing. And it's a, buyer beware to some degree, in that you go in and you work with the project developers to make the project what you want.
Yeah, great, thanks. So following up sort of in this space, historically, a lot of stuff where we've questioned baselines or measuring additionality, again, in the static sense, has indicated that it's more of a space issue, right? So it's like, let's just look at where our plot is relative to other plots around us, and whatever our plot is doing or we expect our plot to do, if it's more than what's around it, then that's additional, right? As we move towards the word dynamic, inherently that involves the aspect of time, right? So, can we all agree that basically additionality is not just a space issue, but very much something that needs, where it concerns both space and time? All right. So we got thumbs up. See Margarita nodding. All right.
Yeah. For me, the good side on that is that looking forward to the future, you can actually acknowledge for some of the things that Lilli mentioned about disturbance. When in static baseline, you're trusting the universe that that's gonna be the case. That's gonna be the behavior. And as I mentioned, there's a biological uncertainty bound to ecosystems. Not all baselines are the same. We don't come all from the same point, and probably areas that you were matching in the beginning to create that baseline are not going to behave the same. So I feel like that's how dynamics baselines now are helping to account for that uncertainty. And I don't know if the other ones agree and want to add something to that.
Sorry, I didn't want to leave you hanging. I was answering a question in the chat.
Difficult to multitask.
Yeah, no, I was also trying to add the link to like Society of American Foresters, the offset statement that we just put out. I mean, completely selfishly because I wrote that, but just thinking again, like more in terms of what Margarita is doing too, is that when we, like Greg he mentioned that 158 projects and 6.1 million acres and that is that we're also trying to figure out like in my lab, and we published a bit about it too, is like what sort of management is applied, because when I ask my first or I mean, they're not mine. If I ask first, second, third, fourth year students coming out of a forestry program what improved forest management is, they can't really answer that question because we don't use that term in forest management and silviculture. So that's what we've been trying to hone into. And it's just wanted to add that to the discussion is that when we talk about dynamic baselines, management will, of course, affect that. But if we think about, rotation times and cutting cycles in forests in the US. These are decades. So I I guess the first concern that the forestry community tends to have, that a lot of folks decide to forego management and being sort of afraid that they will go below that baseline, when in some cases, again, management would be a key component in maintaining that forest in the landscape, for a longer time. And other thing too is that, the terminology, like we have examples where we've read the, transparency issues. Like we have all this, the offset project documentation is publicly available online, but some of the projects have 68 documents, some of them have 8. So we've been scouring through them with students and looking for keywords in forestry. And my favorite example was like a 6-acre project or something. And maybe it's like 15, but still that used the word even aged, uneven aged, shelter wood, sea tree, and pile burning. And if you work in forestry, some of these might be contradictory, even in that space. So again, we have this mix of sort of on the ground, operation practical forest management and silviculture, and then this market component that at the level of defining what improved forest management, we don't really agree, I guess, or we don't have a definition, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Sort of transitioning just a little bit, and this is for you, Greg, so finish answering your question. You've already alluded a little bit to some of the protocols and programs and what's emerged or is emerging. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about, in your opinion, sort of what carbon programs are doing, aspects of baselines and additionality well, and why.
Oh, wow. So maybe you have to say bad things. So a lot of what's been going on that I mentioned in ACR is kind of the last flush of what we call 1.3 and the beginning flush of what there was version 2.0. The dynamic adjustment I was referring to was ACR's kind of answer to the Vera dynamic baseline. So it involves three potential baseline criteria for dropping your harvest. The first one is kind of a complex, let me joke-ish, whatever. I don't like the first one. It's a GIS exercise, looking at your neighbors and how much harvesting your neighbors are doing on a per acre basis and applying that to your baseline harvest schedule. I think there's a lot of room to game the system there in terms of picking the people that you think are your representative neighbors. The second one is growth only. So you can only harvest up to growth in your baseline simulation, which would eliminate some of the avoided emissions kind of gaming of the system there. The third one is you have to have a harvest plan that's at least 3 years old, not more than 10 years old. And I think that was envisioned as something that states or tribes would use when they did projects. But if I do see some industrial people out in the chat, they do a lot of planning too. And I don't think ACR envisioned people bringing in their existing forest plans to use as a baseline. I think it's a great way to do it and keep that kind of counterfactual baseline. It's a cheaper way to do a project. It's a more consistent way to do a project in terms of going the VCS route. So that's kind of the landscape right now. Is if you're going to do a project under ACR, which people are doing, it's going to be this 2.1 methodology, and your baseline is going to be derived by one of those three things. A mapping exercise that's probably out of your pay grade, removals only, or don't cut more than growth in the baseline, or you have to have a management plan that's 3 to 10 years old. I think that's a good thing, because there was still baseline manipulation going on in the project I looked at since September that I thought we kind of washed out of the market.
And Greg, maybe you already alluded to this, but there's also the challenges between establishing an offset project on a contiguous parcel owned by one entity for an extended period of time has fewer challenges with baseline additionality than multiple parcels across a landscape, aggregating, multiple owners, multiple paths, all that kind of stuff. I don't know if you wanted to speak to that. That's the direction of scaling, but it's also it's a scaling problem.
Yeah. Well, and that gets you towards, I guess, the other ACR methodology. That's the kind of the finite one, the core carbon. They can address this next week, why leakage would be one thing for a bunch of non-industrial privates, one thing for industry, and why it might be entirely different when you move across the border into Canada. I don't think that's an issue necessarily in those projects. The aggregated projects, what the issue tends to be is not a baseline issue per se. It's an issue related to people coming in or out of the aggregated project, or land sales within the aggregated project where you have to break some part of that original baseline out to the individual projects so they can move on different funds. You see that a lot where you have your pooling of funds to buy properties, and then some of those funds will sell out, and you have to figure out how you make them whole on the way out, given their perhaps skewed contribution to the baseline counterfactual. So I don't know if I answered that at all.
Great, thanks. So I'm gonna wrap up with one last question for the panel. Given that this is a sort of SAF inspired event as well, sort of how can SAF and their members get more involved and influential in carbon market methodologies? So what can we do next? What can the organization do? Lilli, you've already alluded to the position statement, right? But I guess individuals, within SAF, what can they do? How can they become more involved, more influential? Particularly if this is, based on our riveting discussion, becoming a much more passionate concern to them.
Okay, well, I would highly encourage membership across SAF to reach out to their regional leaders. So all the different regions in the country have SAF chapters. Many of them, I would say actually most, are very active. California has one, and there's a bunch across the state. So usually, in terms of the how current forest policy changes, and particularly coming from the membership, the grassroots level, how we hear about it at the policy committee and so is just through either the official channels of SAF or just working with the sort of working groups in SAF or hearing from the membership. And just a reminder there too, that when we do send out some of these policy statements, including the offset one, it went out through the membership for comments. So I'm the one then receiving those comments and they're taken into account in this case, because I was the lead for that one. But thinking of other things that we're working on, forest and climate change statement for this year and so forth. So I think uh, feedback from just membership is welcome. A couple other things I would say too is that, having that forestry voice in this discussion is just like as cliche as it sounds, but becoming involved with SAF is just quite simply a really good way of having a say in this process, because then people who are a lot higher up than I am, and I'm not employed by the organization, so they have, access to folks who are in the, a couple miles from where I'm sitting on the hill and approving laws or not. Um, so there's that. And also just the technical knowledge. A lot of folks in SAF and across the forestry profession have very intricate skill sets in assessing like on the ground effects of, management and quantifying it. So I think that kind of uh, knowledge and professional like skill sets are something that are always welcome in the discourse, and that they should be part of it too. So because again, I feel like somehow there's this notion in the community that these offsets are very much a market led effort. People who are who wear blue suits every day are leading the effort of selling these offsets, and not folks who are out there in the woods in a sort of a cliched way, I guess, of saying that.
Yeah, that's a great point in the end, right? And we alluded to that earlier, is that basically let's bring the foresters back into the improved forest management part of this, right? And have it not be so dominated in our mind, like you said, by blue suits, right? Ultimately, it's all dependent on measurements that folks on this call make, right? And the relative sort of either agencies, either at the state, federal level, right, that we interact with, that they're dependent on, right? And then all the actual sort of principles of forest and forest management. They're ultimately driving actually what these measurements are, right? And ultimately it's the foresters that and land managers that can influence what is actually happening on the ground, right? So by getting more of a voice, then maybe we can have more influence on how all these things operate.
And I just like want to add one more thing to that though. Like we highlight also in the offset statement, carbon is just one of the services that forests provide. So that's again another important point that we should make as foresters and as people working in this realm of ecology and science, is that we can't just always focus on carbon. That then we forget all the other things.
Yeah, and the key is to find right multi-use, multi-benefit from these choices that we make. Greg or Margarita, any last words from either of you before we kind of, I guess, open up to some of the questions?
Yeah, I think that just building on what Lilli was discussing, I think that people that is actually working with private landowners is a key nexus to send the message. That's all about what carbon stewardship is about. And that is what is gonna, as I mentioned in one of the slides, like engage people to understand this is not only carbon that you're managing for, you can also build all these other ecosystem components that are important for the wildlife you care about, for your water security, for all these other things that maybe is firewoods, etc. So I think that just building in the community the sense of transpassing the message on and building the evidence. Probably a lot of people here already, as you said, is collecting data, and creating those regional data sets are important too, because at least for dynamic baselines, probably making a bigger availability on data besides FIA will be needed, just because we are not going to be able to match all the projects to the only plots that you have around your region. So I think that's very important from my perspective.
All right, I guess finished out. I see LiDAR having a good point to do there. It's just how do you verify it? So figuring out how to verify LiDAR and remote sensing is one thing. If I was going to hit on one thing, it's that ultimately what's driving this is the fact that offsets are an instrument that can be traded, and that I think what people have to really focus on is it's going to be imperfect when you're measuring it. There has to be a way to measure it, and there has to be some degree of certainty in what you're going to be doing so that you can invest in something that's going to happen over the time that Adam was talking about. You can't, it's really hard to do it on a fly-by-night type thing. I think Family Forest Carbon Program is great in that you're pooling people so the risk is mitigated for those small landowners, but I also think there's options on the other. And then the last thing I would say is it's much easier to smack stuff down and talk about how bad offsets are or how crooked the market is. Remember, this is us trying to do something new with forests to make a change. It's imperfect. We know it is. And so if you want to kind of smack something down, first look for how you can add something constructive and get involved that way.
Great. Well, we have maybe 5-6 more minutes. I'm kind of scrolling through a lot of the open and answered questions. And thanks to everyone for responding. Well, one, pitching your questions, but then for responding on the fly. There is a lot around measurement, so maybe we can just reflect a little bit more. One that's still unanswered, but is probably I should have touched about right in the beginning is, do all baselines use the same carbon pools to calculate, right? And do all methodologies do that? So are we just talking about above ground biomass and that's it, or what pools are covered and how can that influence sort of how we allocate credit? So Greg, you're chuckling, so maybe you have insight there.
Oh, my chuckle would be maybe an inside thing on. I don't believe a baseline should do anything with dead wood. Projects that do things with dead wood in the baseline should be questioned.
Okay, fair enough. But largely everyone at least uses above ground biomass, right? I'd say that's typically the above and below ground biomass.
Yeah, live tree biomass is kind of the standard.
Yeah. Live tree biomass, yeah, correct. Okay, any of those who answered questions, any of them that popped out that you wanted that are worth sort of sharing with the entire group? We had some calls for more research. Again, lots of
publish more research. We're really trying to publish more. But I kind of commenting on to like what Craig said, I think there's support for the offsets in the professional community, at least coming from the professional society. And again, just want to reiterate that creating a credible system that's not just getting the headlines that we saw earlier. Again, it has to involve the forestry community. And the managers who do it on the ground, and the family forest owners, and the diverse group of stakeholders who are involved in forestry in the U.S.
And I think I'll close with just one more that seems to capture in my interpretation, a number of these questions, which has to do about sort of transitioning from a static to dynamic baseline. What's the likelihood, I guess, that that's going to be the norm? And if so, how long might that take to sort of be achieved, given it's a mix of like policy and technology, right? And so, because you got to be able to measure, right? So it deals with the uncertainty and aspects of it, but then also has to be the willingness for people to actually want to accept that that's the sort of standard mode.
Right, and that was kind of handed down from what is ICVCM, the International Commission on Voluntary Carbon Markets, that we should have dynamic baselines, which is what drove the dynamic adjustment thing that ACR is doing. So it's kind of ordained that there is some sort of forward-looking thing that we will have in these projects. It's just how do you incorporate that into a methodology that's out there. So I think dynamic is the future. It's whether it's an adjustment in some way to a baseline counterfactual, or whether it's a true dynamic where you're comparing with kind of the composite control set of plots that you have out on the landscape. I'm looking forward to the future. It's going to be good.
All right. Lilli or Margarita, anything else to add?
No, I agree. I mean, clearly technology is developing rapidly for even in our field. And I think there is, like Margarita works with, family forest owners and folks who are not necessarily on the larger industry side. So I think adding a component of an ecosystem service like offsets can be an important tool. Also, generational shift, folks might not, they want to, preserve or conserve to the sort of traditional sense of not wanting to harvest. That's okay too. So also bringing that perspective into working with diverse groups of stakeholders. So yeah. And I mean, eventually AI is probably going to take all of our jobs. So, I mean,
They're going to grow the trees too?
I'm sure they will.
Yeah. All right. So thank you, everyone. Margarita, Greg, Lilli. Thanks to Chad and Melissa for helping to organize. Chad, I'll pass it over back to you to just sort of do a final pitch for some of these upcoming webinars. Thanks, everyone, for attending, too.
Thank you so much, Adam, for moderating. Thank you to our whole panel for all of the expertise and all the thoughtful dialogue that you all provided. To all the attendees, I'd like to highlight our next upcoming webinar. I think we had some good questions that very much allude to some of the things that we want to talk about in our later webinars as well. So March 11th, we have a panel style webinar on leakage. And then we have some other ones coming up throughout the spring. And I just want to note one last kind of thing related to this year's Learning Exchange series, that we are planning to try to synthesize some of the kind of overarching themes and priorities that we've identified through all these dialogues. And we look forward to being a part of that continuing dialogue to answer questions and also try to increase the integrity of forest carbon offsets and voluntary carbon markets. So with that, I hope everybody has a wonderful afternoon and a great rest of the week.